Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes, an Iron Scales podcast about you, the heroes of cybersecurity. You're about to hear and learn practical and experiential knowledge in our conversations with CISOs, security directors and architects, SOC analysts, and other InfoSec stars so we can become more cyber resilient and safer together. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to Cybersecurity Heroes. I'm your host for today's episode, Brendan Rudd, Community Director at IronScales, an email security platform powered by AI, enhanced by thousands of customer security teams, and built around detecting and removing threats in the inbox. We offer a service that is fast to deploy, easy to operate, and is unparalleled in the ability to stop all types of email threats, including advanced attacks like business email compromise, account takeover, and more. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get into the show. Hey, Jeroen. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, Brandon. Thanks for inviting me again.
A long time no see.
Yeah.
I was hoping to speak with you under less dire circumstances, but nevertheless happy that you are here today to speak to us about everything Log4J and how to help companies. So thanks so much for taking the time out of your crazy week. I know you were just telling me about your last couple of days, so maybe you want to just bring us into your world for a couple minutes before we jump in.
Yeah, sure. Work is crazy. Time is ticking. You need to mitigate on the spot, inform businesses, your partners, and then if you secure infrastructure, then where do you start? So hopefully this talk can help others figure out how to move forward from this rather big revelation.
Yeah, and I can see you're tired. You've been working around the clock with very little sleep this past week. This is no joke. So perhaps what I will start out with is a quick introduction to Log4j. From my understanding, Log4j is one of the most popular logging libraries used online, according to cybersecurity experts. Log4j gives software developers a way to build a record of activity to be used for a variety of purposes, such as troubleshooting, auditing, and data tracking. Because it's both open source and free, the library essentially touches every part of the internet. Would you say that's a satisfactory explanation before we dive in?
I think the scale of what we read and what we see, definitely the last part, but the part is true also, of course, however you summed it up. Yeah, so Log4j is used for how logs are generated in Java applications. So it's delogging facility for Java applications if you don't want to write your own logging for standard. So in other words, it's basically a specific type of cabling harness which allows your speedometer to work. It's not a digital versus analog speedometer, it's how the speedometer works. So yeah, a logging framework, that's what we're talking about, which is vulnerable. However, it just did not log only, it also provided the whole world with a remote code execution vulnerability. And in other words, what that means is that it allowed packets to be ingested and return a return code, which can be used to set up a malicious session. And this was all founded, I think, on Thursday. Some say on Friday, but I believe on Thursday evening this December it was found, and it got raised immediately as a CVSS score of 10 out of 10. So the highest score you can get on a vulnerability. So it was picked up from that onwards from a 0-day unpatched. The Apache Foundation reacted rather quickly. So the developer, I will come back to that later, who maintains the code, provided a patch. But yeah, it's a big thing. And like you said, it's logging. So it's not Java, right? It's not the Java applications, but it's a Java library. So in essence, this means that it's OS agnostic. So it applies to Windows, it applies to Linux, BSD, whatever you run, it can run on everything.
I read a report, I think it was by the cybersecurity firm Cloudflare, that attackers have had a heads up on us for potentially weeks or more. So that sort of should be worrying to everyone that we're pretty behind on this vulnerability.
Yeah, that's a great point to raise. So these big vendors, and I will touch upon one another example later about a web application firewall company who has also some numbers. But based on network and analytics, the analysis done based on network activity, we could see that this was already known to some attackers and it has been exploited. And currently, it was spreading. It's spreading like wildfire because it's so easy to exploit. And above all, it's used in so many components. Name it, and probably it uses Java, especially this vulnerability. So a few examples are VMware. You might run that on premise. Maybe you run things in the cloud, and AWS has some vulnerable components. Gaming platforms such as Steam, of course, logging platforms that use this. So Splunk, Elastic, financials applications, systems to store data, their web GUIs. And all of them are vulnerable and they completely bypass your GUI or your web prompt to log in. So the authentication is bypassed. You can immediately access what you want to access as a malicious entity.
There was a blog by Microsoft that said that state-backed hackers from China, Iran, North Korea, and Turkey have tried to even exploit this recently, and even as recent as Tuesday, the 14th of December, more than 100 hacking attempts were occurring per minute, according to Checkpoint.
Crazy, right? Crazy numbers. And you actually see a burst on the first few days that it got a CVE number. So when a vulnerability gets disclosed, there is a number, and the community will either start to mitigate, patch, and we see that in the first few days there's a spike of exploitation attempts, and with those attempts there are definitely a few successful ones. One vendor in this industry, they provide web application firewalls, and I think I have to quote them on this. That so for over 13 hours ago, they spotted approximately 1.4 million attacks based on this vulnerability. We see a lot of nation states, but of all kind of different levels, trying to get into systems, platforms with this vulnerability. Yes.
Who is affected by this? I know it says the whole internet, but can you be more specific? Who exactly should be the most worried about this?
I think at this point, there is a stage of auto exploitation. So let me try to explain this. The vulnerability is out there, and bad malicious entities know this. Depending on their goal, they will try to hit as many targets as they can and try to compromise as many assets, environments as they can before this gets patched. And this is exactly where the risk lies, because it's very hard to tell if you have been compromised if you don't have layered security in place. If your question is who should be worried, everyone should be worried, because we now see WAFs, firewalls, internet, like Cloudflare, like all these big vendors that have a lot of visibility on network traffic. They are flagging that there's just different groups of malicious entities trying to breach systems. And it really depends on their goal. If it's a short-sighted goal, then they might install a crypto miner, so they have free compute to generate illegal cryptography for crypto mining.
So essentially, even like end users can be exploited to someone else's means.
Yeah, there's definitely an attack path for that. So if you have a router that is exposed to the internet and it uses a web GUI that's vulnerable, then it can jump to the router, and from the router, doesn't have to be the same vulnerability, most likely not, but it can find a way to an endpoint. It can manifest into a very nasty lateral movement scenarios.
So it's really just opened up the attack surface to literally everyone that's connected to the internet and any application.
Well said. Yeah. And again, it really depends on the malicious entity, what they try to achieve. Right, so I gave an example of crypto mine, but it could also be a goal to generate a botnet. So you want to make systems a slave of a bigger network to fire a future attack. They might be quiet for 3 months, 6 months, and try to go proceed with a ransomware attack. Like you said, it really opens the door for many more incidents to evolve from this one.
It almost feels somewhat like COVID-19. In the beginning, when it hit, we didn't really know how bad it was going to get. There was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And this somewhat feels like a similar scenario.
Yeah, and the spreading as well. It can be warmable, so it can be actually crafted as a warmable exploit. So yeah, a great analogy. Yeah.
You were telling me about like how easily weaponizable this is. Do you want to maybe elaborate on that as well?
Yes. So it's extremely easy to use and to exploit this vulnerability because it just requires one string of code. It's just a handful of characters you would need to fire to a vulnerable backend front-end system. That's really bad. It's really bad. It's so bad that when you're listening to this podcast and you have a system or an application with an IP that is reachable from the internet, chances are that it's already too late. In fact, it's better to move on to incident response and assume a breach.
That's crazy. And I want to clarify because you also told me that this was actually discovered, or there was talk about this in 2016 at a Black Hat talk.
Yeah, in 2016, there was a Black Hat talk of, I think it was Alvaro Munoz. I hope I pronounced his name correct. He had only very few views on his talk back then, very underrated. And he actually explained how GNDI can be abused as a remote code executable. Now we linked the Log4J component with this vulnerability, and now we see the consequences of it. So yeah, it's a bit awkward to see his talk, and 5 years later, how we should appreciate the knowledge on the abuse of this. But anyway, almost no one was able to spot it. So it's always easy to look back and say, oh, why didn't we notice this?
So I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining how bad this situation is. So now that we've done that, what should companies do to protect themselves against this vulnerability?
First of all, patch. But that's easily said than done because it's a library and not an application. So how do you know that this library is used within your application or applications or platforms or services or your partner services? And I think the best way to start here is by a list of the Netherlands National Cybersecurity Center. For some reason, it got almost the standard for the whole world to check which application is vulnerable. And you can find this list on GitHub. Search for Log4Shell, GitHub, and NCSC, and you will find a list of the application, which component of the application is vulnerable, and how to mitigate it. And we have a lot of researchers in the industry, a lot of companies as well now that update this list so everyone has one overview to see where the library is used and how to mitigate this risk. Because this is one of the things you first need to do. However, if you find out that you have an application or a web service or something that uses Log4j and it has a public IP, so a global routable IP, which means the internet can reach your site application or what you're running, chances are that it's too late and you might think I have a firewall in front of that. I wouldn't count on it. Web application firewall, I wouldn't count on it. Intrusion detection prevention. We now see that the signatures no longer hold due to an obfuscation. It's hard to say this, but you might be better off by containing and proceeding with incident response there. Yeah. Another way, an alternative to using the NCSC list, is by searching, if you have this capability, on every system that you have for the library. See if it's used. And there are tools for this to do this. I will come back to that later on the show, or we link them in the URL of the podcast. But that's definitely one way. Another way is to search for the hashes of all the vulnerable Log4j binaries on your system. So there's also a nice list of all the hashes which you can use. And maybe you have a central management system to control all your Linux systems or all your Windows systems. So maybe use System Center for this, maybe use Ansible or Puppet. Then you can leverage these platforms to figure out where these vulnerable components are located.
There's a lot of involvement from the security community, governments saying that they wanted this sorted out in government entities by by Christmas, but is this even practical?
I think this incident is not over for Christmas. The effects, like we just touched upon, it will take years before we sorted this out, because the doors have been opened, and every minute, every hour matters when you are publicly exposed to the internet and you have this vulnerability. I think there are a lot of systems compromised. We just don't know yet. And of course, the owners and the companies just don't know yet. It's just a matter of what the malicious entities will do now. So it won't be sorted by Christmas. And incident response to this as well, I don't think so either.
And coming back to how can companies protect themselves? So what will the coming weeks look like, and how should you defend against this vulnerability? You talked about incident response.
Normally, you have some time to react to a vulnerability. And we talked about this in a previous podcast when you are dealing with non-zero day vulnerabilities and how vulnerability management can be a great benefit to staying in control. However, this one is rather unique and nasty because it's a 0 day, so it came unannounced with immense exposure. So vulnerability management can only work here if you have your vulnerability management control in place, if you have your scanners deployed, if external, internal, then it can help you. But still there, we saw that the vendors who provide these services had a delay of 1 or 2 days even. That was concerning, because 1 or 2 days before flagging that you have a critical vulnerability was too late. It could be too late, especially now that we put aside the data from the network companies, which show all these attacks happening every minute. I think we now have some data of 280,000 attacks per hour. So that's a lot. So the best way to proceed is internal assets. Still mitigate, try to patch. If you're listening now and you start right now with mitigating, you might patch a door which has already been breached. So for that reason, I keep emphasizing incident response. Yeah, it's a nasty way to end the year.
You spoke to me about two options, defending against this vulnerability. Where were you going with that?
To be realistic, and if you want to be on the safer side of the bet, I think it's best to make a separation of, is your system that contains Node4j and is when it's in a vulnerable way present, make a distinction. Is it used internally? You might still have time to patch. However, on the other side, if it is not used internally, but other partners, customers, entities, systems can access this asset, please proceed with incident response, because the data we're seeing is that attacks are getting fired, and if it's vulnerable and it's really easy to weaponize this vulnerability, then you might be too late.
Mm-hmm. And was this preventable is a question I have, and I'm sure others.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I guess that would be a great discussion with a lot of industry experts on this. But if we just look back at this specific component, which is developed by, I think, Rolf Goers, if I pronounce his name correctly, and he has two jobs, I think, and one of them is an additional one is unpaid. So he doesn't get paid for it. And this job is maintaining this library. I'm not saying someone else could do a better job, but we're really bad at paying developers for software that is used in critical infrastructure applications, commercial companies, which now has already a multi-million-dollar worth of damage. Yeah, sometimes I hear and I talk with developers on congresses and they say, my dream is just to develop open source full time. And yet there are only 3 people sponsoring this raw of Goers for this component. So people, what are we doing here?
But wouldn't you say that because it's open source, there are millions of developers that can raise a flag to report back? Why wouldn't this have been spotted with so many eyes on glass, as they say?
Yeah, now that you look at the vulnerability and you can see it's just one string, right? We see it in the pictures, in the memes, in articles, in logs. So we're like, why did no one try to fuzz it?
So it's like a needle in a haystack, is what you're trying to say.
Yeah, you need to combine very unlikely things together because there are 2 protocols used, and then yeah, difficult though. Another way this could have been prevented in a way is that we less tie things together. And I think the open BSD mentality mindset is a great example. And basically, what they make, it's an operating system. It's very secure. Their slogan is secure by default. And they do this by creating as less dependencies as possible and just making components, applications, libraries just for the sole purpose of one thing. And that could help us as well. So the next Log4J vulnerability can be, I wouldn't say can be prevented, but we can have less likely incidents like this. Respect the sole purpose of just one application or system or library. Another bad example is OpenSSL. It's just a Swiss Army knife of doing everything. And we see that also sometimes goes wrong.
As we wrap up here today, are there any additional tools or resources or recommendations that you can give for anyone needing that extra support and anything to make their life easier, whoever's on the front lines on this?
Yeah, let me start with the most boring one. Know what you have. And I know no one has a complete CMDB, but you need to make a list. Do it in Excel or wherever you can, what you have and where it can be used in. And NCSE, GitHub, Log4j, Shell website can be a great source to start by looking up what is vulnerable and what you might have or what your partners use. So start with that. Then from there on, depending if you're developing, go through your source code, see if it's used somewhere. If you don't develop, use your system administrative tools to check if you have it and where it's used. Maybe you have the luxury to leverage vulnerability management tools. If not, there are also 2 free open source tools available that can help you here. The first one I want to touch upon is Log4j Scan. Again, if you Google this one, you find it on GitHub. And it can scan all your assets, internal or external, based on a whole list of IPs. It has an option for that. So that will help you to see where you might have been compromised or where you're vulnerable. And then the second tool as a freebie I would like to point out to is Log4j to scan. It's also on GitHub. And this tool can check inside a library, so in a jar file, if it's vulnerable or not. So that's a great tool as well.
Awesome. And as we wrap up here today, is there anything else you would like to add? Anything you think we maybe missed?
I think we touched upon everything that is good to know now. One thing I do want to give as a takeaway, if you doubt between business impact, right, of patching or not, please patch and please shut things down. If you're in doubt, just think about what's worse, patching and you're not sure if the patch will have impact, or shutting something down temporarily until a patch is available, or getting compromised, or living with a compromised asset.
Jeroen, thank you so much. I wish you good luck in the rest of your week. Hope you get some sleep. And thank you so much for taking the time from helping your customers with this to chat with us today on Cybersecurity Heroes.
Thanks for having me again, Brandon.
Good luck, and to the rest of you, we'll see you next time.
Cheers.
And if anybody wants to brush up on their vulnerability management practices, Jeroen and I did an episode a few weeks ago, so go check that out. I think it's 2 episodes back.
That's a wrap for this episode of Cybersecurity Heroes. Practical and experiential knowledge on a day in the life of security heroes. Catch our next episode by subscribing through your favorite podcast platform. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating for the show. They really help a lot. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.